Imagine making dinner when you don't have a kitchen at home. Sounds like a nightmare, right? But that was daily life for the ancient Romans. So how did they cook their meals? Did they have secret cooking tricks we don't know about? Let's dig into the surprising ways Romans kept their bellies full, without a modern kitchen. Back in the day, cooking often revolved around the focus, a hearth that wasn't just a stove, but a spiritual centerpiece. It sat right in front of the lararium, the home altar where little statues of guardian spirits, the lares and peasants, watched over the house. People didn't just cook there, they made offerings to their household gods, hoping for protection and prosperity. Some hearths were built into the wall, while others were more like portable stoves with stone or bronze legs. Over time, as separate kitchens became common, the focus stopped being a cooking spot and was mostly used for religious rituals and to keep the home warm, kind of like how fireplaces today are more about aesthetics and coziness than actual heating. Romans weren't stuck with just one way to cook, though. They had portable stoves and ovens, some of which even came with built-in grills and water pots. In Pompeii, most homes had separate kitchens, some small, some massive, like the one in the Villa of the Mysteries, which was as big as a modern studio apartment. Many of these kitchens had no roofs, which, surprisingly, worked out well because it let the smoke escape naturally. The kitchens that did have roofs, total smoke traps. Since chimneys weren't a thing for private homes yet, they only showed up in the 12th century. Ventilation relied on high windows or simple ceiling holes. Public bakeries and smithies, though, were ahead of the curve and actually had chimneys, because even ancient Romans knew that too much smoke wasn't great for business. A well-equipped Roman kitchen had more than just a place to start a fire. Many kitchens had proper ovens, sometimes even two, like in the Villa of the Mysteries. These ovens were square or dome-shaped, built from brick or stone, and had floors made of granite or even lava rock. To heat them up, they'd stuff them full of dry twigs and set them ablaze, creating a powerful, long-lasting fire. Once hot, they were ready to bake bread, roast meat, or even make elaborate dishes. The walls of Roman kitchens were lined with hooks and chains holding every cooking tool you could think of: pots, pans, knives, meat forks, sieves, graters, spits, tongs, cheese slicers, nutcrackers, measuring jugs, and even pâté molds. If you walked into a Roman kitchen, it wouldn't feel all that different from a modern kitchen today. Sure, no fancy gas stoves or electric ovens, but their setups were surprisingly advanced. They had specialized equipment for different types of cooking, much like we have blenders, toasters, and slow cookers today. If anything, Romans proved that good food wasn't about fancy tech. It was about knowing how to work with what you had. But Roman cooking wasn't just about feeding the family. It was also deeply tied to religion and tradition. One of the most surprising discoveries: Romans sometimes intentionally burned their food as offerings to the gods. In Pompeii, archaeologists found charred grapes, cheese, bread, and pastries that had been tossed into courtyard gardens as sacrifices. Imagine throwing your favorite dish into the fire just to please the household spirits. Would you do it? Speaking of meals, ever wonder what the Romans called breakfast? Gentaculum, yes, which was eaten at dawn, but it wasn't anything fancy. The real deal was cena, the main meal of the day. Originally, cena was eaten around midday, but as Rome expanded and imported more food, it got bigger and fancier and was eventually pushed into the evening. That left a small midday snack, prandium, just to hold people over until the big feast. Meanwhile, the old-school evening meal vesperna just disappeared altogether. The lower classes stuck to their old routines since their lives revolved around manual labor. But the upper classes, they were living large. Ancient Roman food changed a lot over time. In the beginning, rich and poor people ate similar meals, but as Rome expanded into a massive empire, the wealthy started feasting on fancy dishes, while the poor had to settle for whatever they could get. Political changes and trade with foreign lands introduced new ingredients and cooking styles, making Roman cuisine more diverse as the empire grew. For the rich, mornings were all about business and getting stuff done. Once prandium was over, they'd wrap up any remaining responsibilities and hit the baths to relax. Around 2 p.m, cena would start, and if guests were invited, it could stretch on for hours, sometimes lasting deep into the night. And because the Romans loved their wine, Dinner was often followed by a drinking party called commissatio, where people just kept the booze flowing. But what were they actually eating? In the early days, especially during the Kingdom and early Republic, people weren't having elaborate feasts. The go-to meal was pulse, a thick porridge made from emmer wheat, water, salt. If you had a little more money, you might jazz it up with some olive oil and whatever vegetables were around. The wealthy added eggs, cheese, and honey to theirs, and on special occasions, maybe even some meat or fish. As time went on, Cena got way more structured. By the end of the Republic, it had turned into a 3-course event. First came the gustatio, appetizer, then the prime mensae, main course, and finally the secundi mensae, dessert. Dessert wasn't just sweet stuff. It often included seafood like shrimp and mollusks. And what about the Roman soldiers? The legions didn't go hungry. Their staple food was wheat, which they turned into bread or porridge, but they also got vegetables and plenty of meat. By the 4th century, a lot of soldiers were eating just as well as the average Roman citizen. Depending on where they were stationed, their meat rations could vary. Pork was the top choice, but in places like Northern Gaul and Britannia, mutton was more popular. So yeah, even the Roman army was eating pretty well, as long as they weren't stuck in a food shortage. Ancient Romans had access to a ton of different foods, and thanks to their massive empire, they imported ingredients from all over. The Roman colonies also supplied Rome with ham from Belgium, oysters from Brittany, fish from Pontus, wild game from Tunisia, and even flowers from Egypt. They were also obsessed with garum, a strong-smelling fermented fish sauce that came from places like Mauritania. If that wasn't weird enough, they also imported silphium, a plant from Cyrenaica that was so popular it eventually went extinct. A lot of what they ate would look familiar to us today. Pliny the Elder, Rome's ultimate foodie, wrote about more than 30 types of olives and 40 varieties of pears, plus figs from Africa and the eastern provinces. They also had a crazy selection of vegetables, some of which don't even exist anymore. Romans ate cabbage, kale, broccoli, garlic, onions, leeks, asparagus, radishes, turnips, parsnips, beets, green peas, chard, celery, cucumbers, and even flower bulbs. Carrots were on the menu too, but not the orange ones we know today. Those didn't exist yet. Archaeologists have uncovered some more surprising clues about what Romans ate. In Spain, they found tiny plant fossils in an ancient cemetery. In England, they discovered burnt figs in a Roman shop, leftovers from when Queen Boudica's army set the place on fire. In Herculaneum, a city buried by a volcanic eruption, they found bowls of chickpeas and fruit perfectly preserved under layers of ash. But the strangest clues came from the sewers. There, researchers found tiny fish bones, sea urchin spines, and traces of herbs and vegetables like dill, coriander, lentils, cabbage, and even opium poppy. It paints a picture of a diet rich in seafood and plant-based foods. But if you think ancient Rome's food was just an early version of Italian cuisine, think again. Some of today's most iconic Italian ingredients weren't even around back then. Tomatoes, potatoes, spinach, eggplant, peppers, maize, which we use for polenta. And most beans didn't show up in Europe until after the discovery of the Americas. That means no tomato sauce, no pasta alla norma, no polenta, and definitely no pizza as we know it. They knew about rice, but it was super rare. Even citrus fruits were limited. Lemons didn't make their way into Italy until the 2nd century AD, and they weren't widely grown. So, while the Romans had an impressive variety of food, a lot of the ingredients we associate with Italian cooking today were still centuries away from being introduced. With tomatoes, pasta, and polenta missing from the Roman diet, bread and grains became the real backbone of their meals. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. By 123 BC, the Roman state was handing out massive wheat rations, known as the frumentatio, to around 200,000 people every month. At first, they had to pay for it, but in 58 BC, politician Publius Clodius Pulcher scrapped the charge, making it a free handout for Roman citizens living in the city. Early on, Romans ate simple flat, round loaves made from emmer, a grain similar to wheat, with just a bit of salt. But once wheat bread became common around the 1st century AD, it quickly took over. The kind of bread you ate depended on your social status. Soft, white bread was for the elite, darker loaves for the middle class, and the poorest got the coarsest, darkest bread. Some people made it tastier by dipping it in wine or eating it with olives, cheese, and grapes. By the time Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD, the city had at least 33 bakeries, proving how central bread was to daily life. But it wasn't all about plain loaves. Roman bakers got creative, making sweet buns with blackcurrants, cheesecakes with flour, honey, eggs, and ricotta-like cheese, and wine cakes flavored with honey, cinnamon, and reduced red wine. The wealthiest enjoyed fruit tarts, but for the lower classes, these were a luxury they couldn't afford. Beyond solid bread, Romans also used it in soups and broths. One dish, Jacellum, was a warm spiced broth thickened with grated bread and mixed with eggs, sage, and saffron. This recipe is recorded in Apicius, a famous Roman cookbook from the late 4th or early 5th century, showing just how inventive they could be with their ingredients. While bread was a daily staple, meat was a different story, something most Romans didn't eat regularly. Butcher's meat was a luxury, not an everyday meal. Pork was by far the most popular, especially in the form of sausages, while beef was surprisingly rare. Unlike the Greeks, who ate more beef, Romans barely mentioned it. Poets like Juvenal and Horace didn't even bother writing about it. Cows were far more valuable alive, providing milk or working the fields. And when they did end up as food, the meat was usually tough and unappealing. Veal made occasional appearances, but overall, beef was an afterthought. For most Romans, seafood, game, and poultry were much more common sources of protein. Ducks, geese, and various wild animals made it to the table more often than expensive butchered meat. Even in lavish public feasts, like the one Julius Caesar threw for 260,000 of Rome's poorer citizens, these were the go-to options. Despite the grand scale of the event, there was no butcher's meat on the menu. That kind of meal was usually reserved for religious sacrifices or the extravagant banquets of the rich. But if you really wanted to show off your wealth, you didn't serve steak, you served dormice. Yes, small, plump rodents were considered a delicacy, and the richer you were, the more likely you were to have them at your table. Some elites even went as far as weighing dormice in front of their guests to flex how big and juicy they were. At one point, a sumptuary law under Marcus Aemilius Scaurus tried to ban their consumption, but Romans weren't about to give up their favourite high-status snack. Even laws couldn't stop the upper class from indulging in their tiny, roasted delicacies. While Romans might have struggled to get their hands on quality meat, they had no shortage of fruits and vegetables to keep their meals interesting. Fresh fruit was a seasonal treat, but when winter rolled in, they dried or preserved whatever they could. Apples, pears, figs, grapes, and pomegranates were all common, while more exotic fruits like azaroles and medlars were harder to find. Some of their favourites, like cherries and apricots, didn't even exist in Rome until the 1st century BC, and peaches only arrived from Persia in the 1st century AD. Oranges and lemons were around, but they weren't kitchen staples. They were mostly used as medicine. In fact, lemons weren't even widely grown in Italy until the Roman Principate. But Romans didn't just eat fruit as it was. They got creative with it. They had at least 35 kinds of pears and 3 types of apples, and they experimented with recipes like pear and peach creams, as well as milk puddings sweetened with honey, spiced with pepper, and even mixed with garum, their infamous fermented fish sauce. As strange as it sounds, the combination of sweet, spicy, and umami flavors was completely normal for Roman cuisine. They also preserved figs in a way that sounds surprisingly modern, crushing them into a paste with anise, fennel seed, cumin, and toasted sesame before wrapping them in fig leaves. Vegetables were just as important in the Roman diet, but not in the way we know them today. Brussels sprouts, artichokes, peas, and cauliflower were still in their early forms, far from the versions we eat now. Cabbage, however, was everywhere. Some Romans ate it raw, dipping it in vinegar, while others preferred it cooked. Cato, a Roman statesman, swore by cabbage, not just for food, but as a cure-all. He believed eating tons of it and then bathing in his own urine could heal the sick. Let's just say Roman medicine had some interesting ideas. When it came to legumes, options were limited, but still essential. Dried peas, fava beans, chickpeas, lentils, and lupins were their go-to sources of plant-based protein. Chickpeas, in particular, were a big deal. They came in different varieties like Venus, Ram, and Punic, and could be eaten roasted as a snack or cooked into broths. Along with their fruits and vegetables, the Romans had a serious love for nuts, just like today's generation, of course. Walnuts, almonds, pistachios, chestnuts, hazelnuts, pine nuts, and sesame seeds were all part of their diet, and they weren't just for snacking. These nuts were ground up and used to thicken sauces, especially for roasted meats and birds. Imagine a spiced, sweet wine sauce infused with crushed nuts, either drizzled over a roasted duck or served on the side. They even made something similar to pesto, blending nuts into savory sauces for cold cuts. Today, we use nuts in similar ways, like grinding almonds for marzipan or using pine nuts for pesto, but the Romans were way ahead of the game. Nuts weren't just for dishes either. They were baked into pastries, tarts, and puddings, all sweetened with honey, since sugar, as we know it, wasn't around yet. If you've ever had baklava or nut-stuffed desserts, like Italian Torrone, you're getting pretty close to the kind of treats Romans might have enjoyed. Dairy played a big role in their diet, but it was mostly about cheese rather than milk. By the time of the Roman Empire, cheese-making was a well-established craft, and it wasn't just for the rich, it was part of standard rations for Roman soldiers too. If you were marching with the legions, you'd likely have a hunk of cheese in your pack, alongside bread and grains. Even civilians relied on cheese for an easy, nutritious food. The cheese industry was so important that Emperor Diocletian 284 to 305 shad to set maximum prices for it, a move that sounds a lot like modern governments trying to control food inflation. Several Roman writers were obsessed with cheese. Pliny the Elder described its dietary and medicinal uses. Varro detailed the cheese-making process, and Columella wrote the most in-depth guide on how Romans made their cheese. Unlike today, where cheese is mass-produced and comes in endless varieties, Roman cheese was simpler but still diverse. They had soft, fresh cheeses, similar to ricotta, and aged, harder cheeses, closer to Parmesan or Pecorino. The process wasn't all that different from modern artisanal cheesemaking. Spring and summer were peak production times, and different regions had their own specialties. If you think about it, Romans would probably feel right at home in a fancy European cheese shop today. You think this is it? Well, how can it end without dessert, right? Romans had a serious sweet tooth, but they had to get creative because they didn't have refined sugar or properly churned butter. That didn't stop them from indulging in desserts after their meals, usually accompanied by wine. Instead of candy bars or chocolate cake, they relied on fruit. Lots and lots of fruit. If you were rich, you didn't just eat whatever was in season. You had exotic fruits shipped in from far-off lands. Because what's the point of being wealthy if you're not flexing your imported fruit collection? Since there was no sugar, the sweetest fruits were highly prized. But fresh fruit wasn't the only thing on the Roman dessert table. They also had spira, a type of sweet pastry with a thin, cake-like crust, sometimes filled with fruit. Sound familiar? That's because it's basically an ancient version of a modern fruit tart or Danish pastry. Another favorite was enkithoi, a soft pastry similar to today's sponge cake. So, yes, Romans were snacking on cake centuries before anyone even thought of buttercream frosting. But here's the real question. How did they even survive without chocolate or ice cream? Imagine a world where there's no Nutella, no cheesecake, no cookies. Instead, you're making do with honey, fruit, and flour-based sweets. Sure, it's natural and probably healthier, but what kind of dessert experience is that? Yet somehow, Romans made it work. They might not have had sugar-loaded, artificially flavored desserts like we do today, but they built the foundation for what would eventually become some of the most beloved pastries in the world. Maybe the next time you bite into a fruit tart or a sponge cake, take a second to appreciate the ancient Romans. They were making it happen with way fewer ingredients and a whole lot of determination.